listening to the Decarbonisation Dialogue, a podcast from Salix.
Welcome to the Decarbonisation Dialogue. I am Hannah Walker, and I believe that the best way to communicate a message is by being passionate about what you are talking about. My guest today is Kevin Anderson, who is Professor of Energy and Climate Change in the School of Mechanical, Aerospace and Civil Engineering at the University of Manchester, and is a former director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. He has recent publications in climate policy, Royal Society journals, Nature and Science. He engages widely across all tiers of government, from reporting on aviation-related emissions to the EU Parliament, advising the Prime Minister's Office on carbon trading and having contributed to the development of the UK's Climate Change Act. With his colleague Alice Larkin, Kevin's work on carbon budgets has been pivotal in revealing the reality of rapidly escalating emissions. His work makes clear that there is now little chance of maintaining the rise in global temperatures at below 2°C, and despite repeated high-level statements to the contrary. Moreover, Kevin's research demonstrates that avoiding even a 4°C rise demands a radical reframing of both the climate change agenda and the economic characterisation of contemporary society. Kevin has a decade of industrial experience, principally in the petrochemical industry, and is a chartered engineer and fellow of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, and is a director of Greenstone Carbon Management. That's an awful lot, Kevin. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
Now, let's start with some of the basics. When people hear 1.5 degrees or 2°C, it can sound rather abstract. So in simple terms, what do these numbers actually mean for us?
I think really, if we were to start again, we wouldn't use 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade to frame these things. But given where we are, we're sort of locked into them now. I think we have to remember these are just proxies for what really concerns us about climate change. And what is important about climate change are the impacts. Now, whether that's droughts or floods or more fires or extreme temperatures, these are the things that really matter. And even there, it's the rate of change of impacts that matter. If those impacts occur over 1,000,000 years or 1,000 years, okay. But if those impacts occur over 5 years, 10 years, or even 100 years, then we, as a species, as humans, we probably can't adapt to that. And certainly ecosystems can't evolve at that sort of rate. These temperatures are effectively, if you like, a proxy for collection of impacts. And then every so often, the international negotiations with the policymakers determine what they think are dangerous levels of impacts. And we've used these temperatures to sort of package these sets of impacts. So 1.5 degrees centigrade that came out of the Paris Agreement was the sort of impact associated with that. We thought, well, these are bad, and 2 degrees centigrade, definitely dangerous. Since the Paris Agreement, which was in 2015, it's over a decade ago now, the research on the impacts has led us really to think that the 1.5 degrees C package of impacts are now probably what we should classify as dangerous. And when we get to 2 degrees centigrade, we're already locking in lots of additional feedbacks, and that looks to be a very devastating future. And so these temperatures are just proxies for the impacts and how dangerous we think those impacts will be. The other thing to bear in mind, I think, across all of modern human time, so really all the time that when, if we want to call it, civilization has developed, we've had a very, very stable climate, very stable level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And then literally almost overnight, we're seeing this rapid increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, going up at a phenomenally fast rate, and changes in temperature that did not occur during this very stable period when humans have flourished. So there's a real arrogance and sort of hubris that we somehow think we're the exception. We are the species that we're able to deal with this rapid change that's occurred literally overnight. And so this 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade also very much relates to a time frame. So we're now talking about just the 1.5, we're probably at that now, or very near it. And even 2 degrees centigrade of warming is going to be by the middle of the century. And if we don't do something radically different, then we're heading towards 3 degrees centigrade, and with additional feedbacks, possibly 4 by the end of the century.
But that's very well explained in terms of, and thank you for putting that quite plainly, actually. We talk about unless we do something radically different, and you've said that word. Can you tell us a little bit about what is the carbon budget?
So the carbon budget really is a way to take all the complicated stuff that's in the science and translate that into a useful numerical framing for policy. So it is a scientific framing. It tells us how much carbon dioxide we can dump in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases as well if we want to stay below a certain chance of 1.5 degrees centigrade or 2 degrees centigrade. So the carbon budget relates to a particular chance of a particular temperature. And it tells us how much we can put in the atmosphere from now out until when eventually we've put that much in the atmosphere. So it's a bit like having a salary for life. If you had your salary for life and you use it all up in the first few years, then you can be quite hungry not doing anything later on. And that's really what our carbon budget is. It's our carbon budget forever from now for 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade.
And I know that you work very closely with governments, and we've talked about the 1.5 and the 2, and then I know that we'll talk about 4 in a minute and whether we're ever going to get to that point. But do you think that when you talk to governments, do you think politicians in particular, do you think they're being plain enough with all of us? And how does that add up in terms of the maths of climate?
Yeah. With very few, if almost with any exceptions, really, the politicians are not being honest with the public, with their citizens. But I think some of that is because they're being deliberately dishonest, and it might be for good reasons. It might be, and I don't think these reasons are valid, but it may be like white lies. We daren't tell people. I hear this language all the time. We mustn't scare people. Rather than being honest with people, we mustn't scare them. We must treat them like children. But I think so. Some policymakers are being deliberately dishonest about this for good reasons. Other ones for bad reasons. In other words, they're just doing it because it might help them from a career point of view. They're only interested in the short-term economy from staying in power. They're not really interested in the long-term well-being of their citizens and those elsewhere in the world. Other policymakers are ignorant of the issues. They're simply not up to speed. And other ones, I think, have been misled. And I will go further. I would say deliberately misled by the expert community. So I'm very critical, a lot of my academic colleagues, on climate change and many people in the expert community. We should speak our conclusions clearly and bluntly and courteously. We should not sugarcoat them. And I would say, with very few exceptions, I think people who look at what we need to do on climate change sugarcoat the issues. But as soon as they put a microphone in front of them, they'll tell you a cheery tale about technology is going to solve the problem for us. And as an engineer, I would say technology is a really important part, but it's now too late to solve the problem in isolation. Major social change is necessary. And whether it's the policymakers, the experts, or indeed the journalist community, we dare not raise that issue, or we choose not to raise that issue. Because climate change is a cumulative problem, in other words, every time we put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we're using up more of the budget. And so because it's this cumulative issue, every year we fail to deliver the rates of cuts that are necessary, the next year gets harder and harder again and harder again. And we have failed since the first big international agreement on climate change in 1992. We've failed now for over a third of a century to get any handle on emissions. And that is true of countries like the UK, who pretend it's done a lot, as much as it is globally. Globally, emissions are still going up. Places like the UK coming down a little bit, but if you look at the full carbon footprint of the UK, including our imports and our exports and our flying and our ships and so forth, then we've had nothing like the reduction that is often claimed by governments, or indeed by, in my view, deeply co-opted experts on this.
And that point about not wanting to scare people and making people feel more comfortable. So you're saying we need to be a lot more brutal, because on the Decarbonisation Dialogue on our podcast, I get to speak to amazing people just like you. And most people talk about the balance of not wanting to scare people too much, because you don't want to create this sense of inaction that it's gone too far and our climate has gone too far and it's not repairable. So there's the danger of that happening. People can be frozen in fear. And then also, but you need the statistics and you need the science to create action too.
I have a lot of disagreement with people who take that view. You might be an expert on ocean circulation. You might be an expert on cloud condensation and nuclear. Why do we think we are experts in psychology? Why do we think that we know how to inform the public? Surely our job is to appropriately inform the public of our research and our conclusions, not to sugarcoat it, not to overplay it. And then it's up to the public and other people, policymakers and others, to interpret that as in the way that they think is appropriate for driving action or for putting policies in place. If we deliberately manipulate our information and then pass it on to the next group who might manipulate it again, and the next group. Before you know it, you've got a whole story of delusion. And I would argue on what we need to do about climate change, not on the science, on what we need to do about it. Almost collectively, we swallowed the blue pill a long time ago, and that we are now deeply delusional on this. And I would say it extends not just in the policy realm, right through to what research is funded, how come the obsession is with technologies about the future, technologies for the future, to avoid policies today. That's what they're there for. They're not really about the technology, they're avoidance technologies, effectively. We've now locked in, at a global level, a delusional framing around climate change, that we can somehow solve the problem simply with exotic technologies, rather than the fundamental reshaping that needs to now go on within our societies, within our economies, within our finance systems. That fundamental reshaping is because we have chosen at a leader level, and indeed I've said an expert level, for 30 years to fail on climate change. And every year we fail, the following year gets harder. And so we are now in a position where we've emitted not far off 0.4 of a trillion tons of carbon dioxide now since the Paris Agreement. We've put out more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere primarily from burning fossil fuels since the big 1992 agreement on climate change than in all of human history before that. Every single reasonable metric on climate change, we have fundamentally failed. And we have spinning increasingly cheery yarns about what we can do about it. This is incredibly dangerous. It is our job to be honest to the policymakers, honest to the public, not care about the political sensibilities, not care about any of those things. Be courteous, but honest.
Is the language that we use a huge part of that? So, for example, I'm dying to ask you the question about net zero. It's become a little bit of a no-go word in a way in many areas. Should we be using that phrase at all?
I would say there are two problems with that. One's the zero, and the zero goes to a date. So we typically in the UK and in many places, we talk about net zero 2050. That zero date, remember what I said earlier on, we have a carbon budget. For a particular temperature, we've got a carbon budget. Now, if you carry on emitting like we are today, we're going to use up the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees centigrade in about 2.5 years globally. 2.5 years. For 2 degrees centigrade, we'll use it up in about 12 years. Remember, emissions are still going up. So globally, emissions went up last year by about 1.1%. So emissions at the moment are either going up or possibly they're static this year. They're not coming down. And so we're using up the budget very rapidly. The date comes forward. Because we're failing to bring the emissions down, that date, the 2050 date, comes to 2045, then to 2040. So for 1.5 degrees centigrade, it's only about 20, even if we brought emissions down from today to zero, it'd be about 2030 to be zero carbon. 2030, just around the corner. Not possible. That's why I think 1.5 isn't possible. Even for 2 degrees centigrade, for wealthy countries like the UK, we need to be zero emissions by about the late 2030s. Another way of looking at this is that if you take that carbon budget at a global level for 2 degrees centigrade of warming and simply said, what rate of reduction do we need every year globally? It comes out to almost 8% reduction in emissions. That's almost 8% in carbon dioxide emissions every year. To put that in some sort of context, that's 2 to 3 percentage points higher than the reduction that occurred in the stringent year of the COVID epidemic. That was 1 year. We would have to do that every single year till we got to zero emissions. Where do we hear this? This is simply take the science, do the maths. Because that provides us now with too scary story, we hide behind net zero. So, and the net part is another part of the zero story, which is dangerous. So the zero needs to go with a date and needs to go with a pathway. But the net part is we're not really going to go to zero. That's what the net means. We're going to carry on because the wealthy of us want to carry on some activities which we can't decarbonize, like lots and lots of flying. And so we're going to pretend that that not us, our children will suck the carbon dioxide out in the atmosphere so we can carry on expanding the airports. So our Prime Minister goes to the last COP, the big international negotiation in Brazil, and says that the UK is on line for 1.5 degrees centigrade, and yet is enthusiastically looking to expand our airports. That only holds together because he's relying on our grandchildren and our grandchildren to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, with fingers crossed that we don't get any tipping points or feedbacks in between. So I think that the net zero framing has, from a political and from a journalist point of view, is incredibly unhelpful and I would say dangerous.
Yes. Okay. Because you mentioned aviation, because of course, obviously you've done a lot of work on aviation and we are flying for all of us, people who are listening. we might have relatives abroad, we're going on holiday, people are still flying all over the place. And you've just talked about expansion of airports, etc. And before that, you were talking about behavioural social change. Can we keep flying then? What we as much as we're flying, we're increasingly flying all over the world. I mean, in fact, you mentioned our grandchildren, our children. I'll hold my hands up. My children fly a lot. I mean, they're young, they want to go exploring, and they're off all over the world.
It's symbolic of the problems we face, which are broadly ones of equity. Remember, when we say, do we have to stop flying? Most people don't fly. Globally, most people don't fly. And even in the UK, these figures are a little bit outdated, the Department for Transport data, but broadly half the population in the UK doesn't fly in any one year. And about 70 to 75% of all flights are just taken by 15% of the population. So I think flying is really emblematic of the deep inequality we have in our society, which we then pretend we're all in this together. This goes into one of my other issues here, that the climate change issue is deeply about equity. It wasn't originally, we could have solved it from a technical point of view, but the later we've left it, the more and more it becomes about social change and equity. You cannot squeeze emissions out of people that barely emit. Those of us that fly frequently, typically we're the ones who also have bigger houses, larger cars, buy more goods. So it's very much related to wealth and income. And so even if you look at somewhere like the UK, most people in the UK, sort of middle to low income people in the UK, they're structurally locked into a poor quality house, poor quality public transport, probably an old car. They can't afford solar panels. They can't afford to get an EV. They probably can't afford the insulation to really retrofit their houses. So they're structurally locked into their emissions. But most emissions in the UK are discretionary. The wealthier households in the UK use somewhere between 4.5 times more energy than the poorer households. Most of those emissions are discretionary. So the we is really important in this. In wealthy countries, it is the wealthy people in those countries, and this is true, of course, of poorer countries, the wealthy people that dominate the emissions profile. And it's there that the big reductions can come about. But that is almost never discussed. It might be discussed at a global level about fairness, but not within a country. And the reason we don't do that is because who is in that category? Professors, journalists, business leaders, policymakers. We have normalized our lifestyles. We pretend we all live like this. Of course, we don't at all. Most people don't live like this. There is no cost of living crisis in a very rich country like the UK. It's a deliberately manipulated affordability crisis for some. Yes. So when I'm interviewed in the Today programme, the presenters in the Today programme aren't changing their lives, aren't cutting back on their heating of their homes. It's the poorer people who are doing that, and the average income people that are doing that, not the wealthier people. And so we are a very wealthy country, and we have chosen to allocate out the resources and the productive capacity of our society to particular groups of people. And we have to open that dialogue up if we come to climate change, because we need the productive capacity, the labour, the resources, the political capital to be retrofitting our homes, to be putting in the public transport infrastructure, to be building the renewables. Instead, they're not doing that. These people are facilitating those of us who live in nice houses, the extensions, improve our bathrooms, bigger kitchens, all the rest of it. So the flying is emblematic, I think, of that deep inequality. Not that many people fly. We often blame the people who fly occasionally to Benidorm every second or third year. And we've normalised that we're all in this together. We're not, because we've left it so late. Yes. And that comes out of the maths, not out of a moral argument. So regardless of your moral argument, if you want to stick to 1.5 or say 2 degrees centigrade, equity is a key component along with technical change.
For most of us, we're heading towards this global warming. We're heading towards the 3 and 4 degrees that you've talked about. You want, obviously, a greater honesty and transparency in what is happening to our climate. To a large extent, we look at climate news every day, whether it's seen as this is what's happening to our planet, or whether it's seen as there's just flooding, there's just wildfires. We're seeing, climate migrants, people move, shifting out of their homes. And as you say, it's often there's a great sense of inequality, and it's often the poorest people who are affected the most by these impacts. But we do see it on our news. But we are heading towards a warmer climate. What does that really look like for us?
I use the term now that there are no non-radical futures. the future is radically different to the present, either because we do something about climate change, which will ask some fundamental questions about our norms and our values and our structures, or we just carry on with the lies and delusion, and the climate change will get worse and worse. And then I think there's a sort of a belief amongst some, and certainly I've heard that pontificated by some of the very, very wealthy sort of tech bros and so forth, that they somehow think we're going to technically get a way out of this. And what they mean by that, of course, is they think that they can build big enough walls around themselves that they will survive. So they think there's small enclaves of human society may well be able to just carry on business as usual. I think that completely misunderstands the systemic nature of climate change. Climate change, well, first, it goes along with all the other ecological damage and some of the social challenges as well. But climate change means things like rapidly changing reducing or changing pollinating insects, which means that rapidly changes our food production. It might reduce food production or move it very significantly. If we lose or significantly weaken the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, in other words, what we would call the Gulf Stream, which is part of this, a big conveyor belt of warmth that moves around our oceans, that is fundamental in giving us the current global climate we have. If that changes, as quite a lot of the evidence suggests it will do, that will massively shift in monsoon patterns and change agricultural patterns. So what we're talking about here is a world where no one would be isolated from this. And I think we will almost certainly be heading towards a period of significant geo-instability in a world where we're going to have 8.5 to 9 billion people. Lots of people will be well armed, have good maps. They're not going to sit still and suffer at home. They're going to move. Mm-hmm. They're going to be, and that means you exacerbate existing tensions. Mm-hmm. And eventually the climate change will cause more tensions, whether that's from food or drought, migration. Where we're heading is utterly disastrous. Mm-hmm. But we're so locked up into somehow thinking that the ephemeral political norms we have today have existed forever. They haven't. They're very, very short-lived.
Yes.
And we think we can't change them. We can chart the evidence that we're going to hell in a handcart very quickly, but we appear to be unable to do anything about it.
We're coming to the end of the interview. I would like to end the interview asking you whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, but the messages that you're giving are quite bleak, aren't they? Obviously very bleak. You're giving a very real picture of what is happening to our climate, what is happening to our future, and no one being, actually very strong words there, no one being isolated by what's happening. We all share this one amazing planet that we live on. How do you feel about your contribution? The final question is, you're working in this arena, you're talking to governments, you're advising governments, you're speaking to people like me, you're spreading you're communicating a very clear picture backed up by science. How does that make your job feel when you're talking to people like me and you're trying to communicate what's happening to our planet? I
try to, in my own head, and even when I talk to other people, I try not to say I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I try to take the data and be what I might call a realist in my own head. I'm not hopeful, I don't think it's hopeless. I quite like, and I often use it to end some of my talks, the Antonio Gramsci quote, pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. Mm-hmm. Everything I do from my work point of view, okay, we're doing well on renewables, but we're still burning more fossil fuels. And the climate only cares about the fossil fuels. It doesn't care about the renewables and other agricultural things to do with diets and so forth. All the analysis tells me things are looking dire, but we're not locked into that future. If I'm not a betting person, if I was, I think we're going to go, it's going to be a terrible future. I think if you look at our children from 2050 to 2100, I really despair for what future they're very likely to have. But that's not locked in stone yet. And so the optimism of the will is, can we change things? Yes, we can change things. Do I think we'll change things? No, I think we will probably choose not to. And let's say the we, that's generally the wealthy in our society, our policymakers, indeed I would say our journalists and a lot of the experts, we won't choose to, but we could do. We could change things very rapidly. That has happened throughout. History is punctuated with very significant changes. Even the 19th and 20th centuries have been punctuated by some very big changes. So we have the capacity to do that, I think. Whether we will or not, the jury's out. The signs aren't looking particularly good. But we have everything at our fingertips. We have the technologies at our fingertips that we know how to deploy today. We know the social changes that are necessary. We know how fast we need to do this. We have lots and lots of material and productivity in our societies and productive capacity. We have very educated populations. We have everything there to do this. Potentially, we can make this rapid change.
We can. And as you say, not locked in stone. So we could change, but it's whether the will is there. Thank you very much to Kevin Anderson. Thank you for providing such incredible insight.
Thank you very much.
Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast channels, and please do email us with your views and ideas at podcast@salixfinance.co.uk. Big thanks to Kevin.
You've been listening to the Decarbonisation Dialogue, a podcast from Salix. For more information about our work and to find more content, please visit salixfinance.co.uk/podcasts.